webinar is provided by REL Northwest, which is operated by Education Northwest. Co-sponsoring today's event are the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences and the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes. We are also excited to have speakers joining us from the Foundation for Child Development, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction's Office of Early Learning, the Nevada Department of Education's Office of Early Learning and Development, and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. If you could please mute your phones so that background noises are minimized. And I wanted to make sure everyone understood we have dedicated time at the end for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. However, I will be pausing at the end of each of our presenters' presentations to take questions at that time, which you can submit through the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, or by raising your hand in the WebEx screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on our website. My name is Fiona Helsel, and I am one of your webinar moderators. I am the Deputy Director for REL Northwest and have been leading our cross-REL efforts in early childhood education. Our other webinar moderator is Jana Martella, my colleague from the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes. Jana is the co-director of CELO and a co-sponsor of this webinar. I'll turn it over to Jana to tell us a little bit about CELO just as soon as I've given you a quick overview of REL Northwest. We are one of 10 regional education labs funded by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. We're currently working with stakeholders in Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington to assist them to use their data systems, to conduct and support high-quality research and evaluation focused on regional priorities, and to help educational policymakers and practitioners incorporate data and research into everyday decision-making. REL Northwest is operated by Education Northwest, which has been serving the 5-state region from our headquarters in Portland, Oregon for almost 50 years. Our work focuses on 3 priorities, including school improvement, equity in special populations, and high school and beyond. Through our regular needs sensing and conversations with regional stakeholders over the last 2 years, REL Northwest has identified early childhood education as a priority area. This webinar is one of REL Northwest's first forays into this newly identified priority area. Our co-sponsor, CELO, has been integral to putting this webinar together, and I'd like to turn it over to Jana to provide you a very brief overview of CELO and their involvement in the REL Northwest webinar.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for engaging us in this process. It's been a great partnership, and we're very happy to hold hands with you on this journey. This is just a slide of CELO's mission and goals page, but you can see right there on the page that our clientele, the 22 comprehensive centers that we work with that are sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education, one of which is the regional center at Education Northwest, along with providing services to the state education agencies and the early learning directors that sit within them, is our primary mission. Our goals and our focus areas have been given to us by the U.S. Department of Education. You can see right, the top bullet is the topic of our webinar today. So this is right in our sweet spot, and we're very eager to hear from a number of both partners on the webinar that we've been working with for a long time, and also to do this with the Northwest. I was really fortunate a week or so ago to be at that very view that Fiona just showed us, and it's not only a lovely place to be, but there are a lot of exciting things that are happening in Oregon and in the Northwest region. So I just want to point out to you our web address that you see here and urge you to do some exploring. If you go to CELO's publications page, probably most relevant, and we'll make sure this gets sent around to all attendees today, is under our publications page, and you'll find an annotated bibliography tab where we have a rather extensive annotated bibliography of the materials, the presentations, the peer learning communities, policy papers, and fast fact short issue briefs, all on comprehensive assessment systems. So we're eager to kind of add this to the list of resources and to hear from your colleagues on the line today, and to hear what questions you have as leaders in this area so that we can together respond to those questions. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you, Jana. So we have 3 goals that we would like to meet by doing this webinar. One is we would like to increase all of our participants' knowledge of how to integrate kindergarten entry assessment into a comprehensive assessment system. We'd like to increase your awareness of the potential to use KEA data to inform teaching practices. And we'd like to increase your awareness of how 2 states are designing their kindergarten entry assessments as part of a comprehensive first through 3rd grade assessment system. To meet these goals, REL Northwest is honored to have 4 speakers joining us today to present on this very important topic of considering kindergarten entry assessments as components of comprehensive systems. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Jacqueline Jones, who is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for Child Development. Following Dr. Jones will be Mr. John Pruitt, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Early Learning in the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Ms. Anna Severance from the Office of Early Learning and Development in the Nevada Department of Education will follow John. And then Dr. Thomas Schultz, who's a senior scientist at CELO and the Director of Early Childhood Initiatives at the CCSSO, will be ending our webinar with some reflection on the presentations. I'm honored to turn the webinar over to Dr. Jacqueline Jones. Prior to joining the Foundation for Child Development, Dr. Jones was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning and Senior Advisor on Early Learning to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. She has also served as Assistant Commissioner for the Division of Early Childhood Education in the New Jersey State Department of Education, where she oversaw the alignment of standards, curricula, and assessments for preschool through 3rd grade programs, and was responsible for the overall implementation of New Jersey state-funded preschool programs. Prior to state and federal government service, Dr. Jones worked for 15 years in the Research Division at the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey. Dr. Jones has also been a visiting associate professor at Harvard University and a visiting scholar for the National Assessment of Educational Progress at ETS. Dr. Jones?
Thank you so much, Fiona. I want to thank Fiona and Jana for inviting me to join this discussion, and I'm really so pleased that we have so many folks on the line to engage in this conversation. I have a charge today, and that is to take us through 3 topics. One is the situation of assessment within the context of high-quality early learning programs. The second is to take a look at these comprehensive assessments and give us a baseline definition and talk about the components. And the third is to talk us through some issues around what I'm going to call purpose and consequence in general. So I get to talk at this 30,000-foot level and give a framework, and then my colleagues from North Carolina and Nevada will speak to what it's really like on the ground trying to implement these assessments. I'm going to speak today from 2 major sources that I want to turn your attention to. One is the newly revised set of standards for educational and psychological testing, These standards were created by three very prominent organizations, AERA, American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education, and they provide us with guidelines for what test makers and test takers ought to do. And I think that it is a useful and important resource for those of you who are in the mix and trying to make decisions about good test selection and implementation. The second source is the National Academy's 2008 publication on early childhood assessment, why, what, and how. It was my honor to serve on that committee, and you will see in many federal guidelines the notion of using this publication and their recommendations. So I just want you to really have a sense of the publication to look at when you see that recommendation to use the guidelines and recommendations from the National Academy study. I think these two resources will serve well, and I'm going to use them this afternoon. I wanted to start with looking at getting a common definition of assessment and to think through what the major components of assessment really ought to be as we think about this process. It is a systematic process. It's not a random process. It's a systematic process, and it's designed to measure or evaluate these characteristics or performances of individuals. And what I really want to turn your attention to is the notion of drawing inferences. So we engage in the process of assessment, not because it's just a fun thing to do, which sometimes it is and sometimes it's not, but we engage in this process in order to answer key questions so that we will have some information about children, about programs, and that information will then charge us to do something, to understand better what our situation is, and then to have appropriate action. So if that can be our baseline definition, systematic process, measuring and evaluating, but always for the purpose of drawing inferences. Assessment, however, does not live in isolation, does not live by itself. And it's part of this very complex and interconnected set of components that make up high-quality early learning systems. So I think it's important to see it as a piece of the work, but not the driver. So assessment reflects the standards that we've decided will tell us what children should know and be able to do, the curriculum that we're using to implement this work, and then the assessment should not drive the curriculum. It should not be that everything hinges on the assessment. We pick standards and assessments and we teach to these assessments. They are tools to let us know how children are doing. So I have a graphic that we hope will give us a better picture of this. So here we have a set of the components of high-quality early learning programs. Now, these components I stole, deliberately, from work that was done
$1,000.
Pardon? The work that was done by the Departments of Education and Health and Human Services. Very early in the Obama administration, both departments got together and started to think about what these early learning systems really look like. And these components you should feel familiar with if you've done any Race to the Top applications. They are the guidelines that we've used. So if you think about early learning standards, we'll just go around the circle. Early learning standards that tell us what children should know and be able to do. And then these assessment systems give us a sense of how to understand where children are in that process. Our program standards tell us the sort of guidelines of how our intervention is going to go. What are the class size ratios? What are the qualifications for teachers? Will we have coaches and master teachers? What really defines that program? The data systems are critical. If we're going to collect information, we need coherent ways of putting that information together and getting it out to the public. Health promotion, when we're talking about programs for young children, is critical. There's nothing more important than making sure that our children are healthy and that we have systems in place to really ensure that that is the case. And then young children live and grow and develop in the context of their families and their communities. And unless our programs engage those families and communities, we have a huge hole in our work. Our workforce is critical. These are the folks who come every day to make sure children are progressing and growing and developing. And so you see the comprehensive assessment systems, while they're important, they simply make up a piece of the work. These pieces are not independent of each other. They are very much tied together. But I just want to make sure we don't see assessment as sitting outside of this everyday of the work that we have to do. It is, in fact, a piece of a critical component, but only a component of the really hard work of putting together high-quality systems. Okay, did they pop up again? And they'll pop up again because we didn't get the animation right, so bear with us. And there we go, how our focus on comprehensive assessment. But let us look at this definition. And for those of you, again, who've written to Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge competitions, this is a definition that will look familiar because it's absolutely from that competition that we crafted this definition. From my perspective, and I speak now as a civilian, the purpose of assessment systems is to tell a story about a program, a story about how children are doing, or even a particular child. And so the system really is coordinated, and that's an important term. It's coordinated system, so things work together. These are assessments that really feed each other information, and you can put them together and get a really good picture. Coordinated, comprehensive set of multiple assessments. And of course, they all have to be valid and reliable for their purpose. But I want to turn your attention to the fact that they organize information about the process and the context of young children's learning. So we're not looking just at a particular data point for a particular moment, but we'd like to be able to have assessment systems that can give us a real story of, over time, how children are developing and the context in which they develop. And so we would look at measures of environmental quality, of teacher-child interaction, and those indications tell us not just how, but in what context the children are receiving the intervention. So if we look at some components, we have screening measures, formative assessments. I don't think that summative assessments were in all of the guidelines for ELC, but I'm going to put them in here. Measures of environmental quality that tell us about the environment, and measures of the quality of adult-child interaction. There certainly are other measures that could be included, and that depends very much on the questions that folks have and want to be answered. But the goal is to really have a set of assessments that work well together and that are not redundant, but that answer the questions one has. As we think about kindergarten entry assessments, we can look at them as summative assessments in some way, although they have been sort of put in the context of some formative assessments, but they are places where we can get an answer to a question that is important in understanding where children are as they enter kindergarten and where they will go. I want to turn us to the issue also of purpose of assessment. I think, from my perspective, everything is driven by purpose. What assessment to use, how often it should be used, how long the assessment should be, if we're looking at a universe of children or a sample, a universe of programs or a sample, all determined by the purpose. And so in this recommendation, and this is directly from the National Academy's report, which assessments to use, how often, how long, the domains, should match the purpose and the requirements and require that a minimum amount of time be used to obtain information. So we want to do this in a way that isn't intrusive, that doesn't take a long period of time to give us the information that we want. I used to talk in terms of elegant assessments that give us the maximum amount of information in the minimum amount of time and intrusion into the program. So the questions, I think, are twofold, and especially for kindergarten entry assessments. There are some policy questions, and we have practice questions. From a policy perspective, the question might be, how are children doing across a state as they enter kindergarten? I can imagine sitting in the state education department office and thinking, well, you know, should we be investing money in early childhood programs, and do we need them? How will we know? How are our children doing? Do they really need this intervention? And then designing a set of measures that would give us a sense of how children are doing. In that case, one would not necessarily need to assess every child. You can get some very good, very solid information with a sample of children. That sample has to be carefully taken, of course, but you can get good information looking at a sample of children. So your process is different. If you have a different kind of question, what I'm going to call the practice question, that question that asks, how can I modify this instruction for a particular child or a particular group of children, then that question really does require that you have a much more careful look at individual children. And so again, your process is different. But I think it's important to always think about, what is my question? How much information do I need? What is that universe of kids or sample of kids that needs to be assessed? And and what's the best instrument? So I want us to go towards some, here. We're going to talk about implementation and assessment selection, instrument selection. So this is another recommendation from the National Academies, and I'll go through a few of these. I'll talk about some consequences from the assessors and then some cautions, and then we can have some conversation. We think about assessments and why we're giving them, then we really should have as a very first step, along with purpose, what do we want to do with it? What are the consequences? So assessments should not be given without some clear plans for follow-up steps that use the information productively and appropriately. Why are we doing this? We said the purpose was to draw inferences. Those inferences then should lead us to do something. So part of the selection process is to make sure that we have an instrument that will give us enough information so that we can act appropriately and in the best interest of children and programs. As far as the assessors, a lot of our kindergarten entry assessments are designed to be administered by classroom teachers, and that may be fine, but let us remember that the assessors need to be trained to meet clearly specified levels of expertise in administering assessments. They should be monitored systematically and should be reevaluated occasionally. I will give you an example from New Jersey. In our program, we had master teachers who did a great job of working very closely with classroom teachers. They had an environmental rating scale that they used. There's a frame for those conversations. And it was tremendously important that we made sure that they were reliable, and each of them was reliable in scoring that assessment. And then we had to go back every so often and do retraining to make sure that they were remaining reliable. And to monitor that process is important. When we have folks who are either classroom teachers or part of the instructional staff doing the assessments, we must really remember that they are our first line of interpretation of these results. If they don't get it right, then we don't really know what we're working with. So a lot of attention needs to be paid to how these folks are really administering the assessments. And this is a lot of language here, my last slide, but it speaks to the caution that I really wanted to talk about in making sure that if we are talking about looking at the status or progress or effectiveness of programs, then we need to make absolutely certain that those children who are children with special needs, or children who are dual language learners, or children from minority groups that may not be well represented in the normative population, that we are understanding very clearly what these assessment results mean for them. For example, for dual language learners, if we want to give language assessments to these children, that's fine, but we need to understand that we have a lot more to learn about how children who are learning multiple languages develop language, if they're learning these languages sequentially or simultaneously. We have a lot to learn about the trajectory of language development. So when we get a score, we may not really know what it means. We may not really know if it means that child is in trouble or if this is what happens in the normal course of learning multiple languages. So there are lots of things to think about as we move forward and administer these assessments, but I have two words again purpose and consequence as we think about the administration. And now I think I am ready for questions. Yep. Oh, okay.
Okay, there's two ways that we can ask a question of Jacqueline. You can type it in the chat box and submit it via the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Or you can raise your hand by clicking on the little hand icon, and we can unmute your line and you can ask the question.
So, Fiona, I want to say that I think you're going to need to repeat the question for me because I just lost my screen here.
Okay, I will do that.
So, thank you. I appreciate it.
So we have a couple of questions that are coming in, and I know that Fiona and I discussed, this is Jana, discussed the idea of having a few in our back pockets. I think we really would want to engage the audience first and foremost. So Fiona, I'll start with the first one that's just come in, and you can move on. We hear from Amy, are there good examples of kindergarten assessments that meet the policy and practice questions equally well, as you've described them, Jacqueline?
Oh, well. You know, I think that is a matter of how they're used. I think the notion of using assessments for multiple purposes has been one that just goes on and on, this argument. But I think one of the National Academy's recommendations was that if you want to use assessments for multiple purposes, then you have to be very, very careful about that purpose. You have to look very carefully at the assessment instrument itself and make sure that you're really assessing a domain that answers both questions. So if you look at the ways in which folks have used formative assessments and then aggregated those data up to make policy decisions, people have done that. And you can do it. You've got to make sure that those data are good, that you spent a lot of time and effort in training folks and making sure that they have the results that you can use, and then aggregating that data up for policy decisions. You can do it. But you have to make sure that at every step you've really taken cautions to make sure that you're getting exactly what you want. And I think our folks in North Carolina and Nevada can talk about their experience also.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We have another question from Lila. What measures are out there for measuring kindergarten entry-level kindergarten readiness? You mean
specific assessments? Well, I'm probably not going to speak to specific assessments. I think, you know, one of the great resources, and Janet, you're going to have to help me with this. Marty Zaslow did a wonderful review of early childhood measures. I think it was called the Early Childhood Measures Profile some time ago, and I think those are the kinds of things you want to look at that give you a sense of reliability and validity of the measures that are out there. But again, I would say, because I'm not going to sort of talk specific measures, think about the questions that you want to ask. Think about what you want to do with the measures that you're using, with the results that you get, and how you want to move forward. If you're looking at formative assessments that can be used to really help teachers understand how children are doing over time and give you an initial point in time as kids enter kindergarten to see how they're doing, that's one thing. If you want to look at policy across the state, then there are other measures you can use. I think there are lots of resources. I think CELO is probably a pretty good resource as you think about how you want to use the measures. So I'm not going to talk specific measures. I think if you have your questions in mind about what you want these assessments to do, then you can get resources that will help you to do that.
So I think that that's a really good response, Jacqueline. Our purpose, and of course yours, would perhaps restrict you from naming particular instruments or particular vendors. But we do have information on how to select instruments and the components that contribute to their quality and that contribute to the quality of information that's collected from them. There's two resources on the CELO page which will make sure that all of the attendees receive later. One, I mentioned a compendium of early childhood assessment resources developed by CELO, but we also have a resource page that has a tab focused on assessment exclusively that contains key high-value resources in that area, early childhood assessment. So you can find the resource, for example, that Jacqueline has mentioned, the NAS report, but also the compendium mentioned there. I also think that our state folks will tell us, give us some process points for making sure that their kindergarten entry assessments are a valid and reliable component of the larger comprehensive assessment system for young children. And I know that Tom will be addressing that as well.
Thank you, Jana. To keep us moving along, I'm going to move us to the next presenter. I just wanted to remind everyone that there will be an opportunity to ask additional questions throughout the webinar and time at the end as well. I also wanted to just give everyone a heads up that we very much appreciate your feedback on this webinar and would appreciate your responding to the webinar survey link that will be sent out following the webinar. I'd like to turn now to Mr. John Pruitt from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. North Carolina is the lead on an enhanced assessment grant and formed a K-3 formative assessment consortium with 8 other states, including Arizona, Delaware, Iowa, Maine, North Dakota, Oregon, Rhode Island, and South Carolina, and the District of Columbia. The consortium is working to develop and enhance a K-3 formative assessment, which includes a kindergarten entry assessment. Mr. Pruitt has over 30 years of experience in early childhood education at both the practitioner and policy levels. Prior to his current position, he was the Assistant Director at the Office of School Readiness in the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. He also served as a Program and Policy Chief for the Office of the Governor in North Carolina and has held teaching positions in institutes of higher education and in elementary school. John?
Well, good afternoon, and I would like to thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation today and to talk about what North Carolina is doing and the work that is occurring around kindergarten entry assessment and K-3 assessment in general. When I thought about today's presentation, I really thought about the question and the title of the webinar, and really how assessments can help ease transitions to kindergarten or improve transitions to kindergarten. More specifically, how a kindergarten entry assessment might accomplish that task or help with that task. In North Carolina, as we wrestled with this question, I think it's fair to ask, what does transition look like in your state? And we've asked that question in North Carolina, and Sharon Ritchie, who's the Director of First School at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, has really been helpful in helping us see the transition that children, in fact, endure as they move from a pre-K setting to a kindergarten setting. So what this slide represents is the typical experiences for children as they move between pre-K and kindergarten, but I just want to point out a couple of things that really speak to what is on the back of children as they move from a pre-K classroom to a kindergarten classroom in a very short time over the course of a summer. If you look at the pre-kindergarten year, you'll notice choice time is a very significant part of a pre-K student's day. Likewise, whole group is less a portion of the day than you will see when a child moves into the kindergarten setting. All of a sudden, when a child moves into kindergarten, 45% of the day is in whole group instruction in classrooms across North Carolina. And choice time, more surprisingly, has shrunk to just 6% of the day. So what is happening in a young child's life in their education experience between those two classrooms that are very close in time is significantly different. And we wanted to sort of wrestle with that question of how can we improve that. Likewise, we've taken a look at class data from the classroom assessment scoring system, Bob Pianta's work out of the University of Virginia. And while this slide represents average class scores from across the nation, the scores are very similar in North Carolina. So if you were to look at instructional support, I'll point to particularly the quality of instructional support in classrooms across the pre-K through grade 3 space is really in the low quality range. And that's concerning because if children are spending more of their time in whole group instruction and the quality of that instruction is poor, are we really maximizing outcomes for children? So as we thought about assessment, we turned to a think tank to really help us wrestle with the questions of what kindergarten entry assessment should look like, and a larger question, what should assessment look like across K-3? Superintendent Atkinson, our state superintendent of public instruction, convened this task force about 18 months ago and really came forward with a report that helped us define or propose claims for essential learning in 5 domains of development. More importantly, this assessment think tank really promoted the use of a formative assessment process, and they provided recommendations for development and implementation of an assessment system. As we've gone about defining and designing this assessment process, I want to be clear that when I speak about formative assessment, I'm speaking about a particular definition that talks about assessment that is occurring within the context of instruction on a daily basis, and it happens through questioning, it happens through observation, it happens through collecting work samples, it happens through embedded tasks and lessons. And so it's in real time. It's not a standalone test, but it is in fact happening within the context of a learning classroom. You'll notice the progression that we've defined, moving from the claims, which are broad learning goals that should be accomplished across the 5 domains of development, constructs, which are more deeper understandings associated to those claims, construct progressions, which are really defined learning goals from very simple to very sophisticated, really illuminating the progression that a child makes. Performance descriptors, which are the things children would be doing in a classroom that would give you some idea of where they would be on a construct progression. And assessment means, what are the things that are happening in a classroom that helps a teacher elicit information? As I mentioned, construct progressions lay out an increasingly more sophisticated understanding of core concepts, principles, and skill development in a domain, and they describe development over a period of time. They provide a picture of what it means to improve in an area of learning. And I think what's important about construct progressions, and that being a significant part of the assessment system that we're putting in place, is it represents a shift for teachers from looking at a child and determining a child knows this or he doesn't know this, to understanding where a child is and where they should go next. And that, while that's subtle in language, it's very profound in actual practice. So moving away from, again, the child does or doesn't know something, to where are they on this progression, where are they headed next, and how I can support them, is really key to a deeper understanding of who a child is and how to move instruction forward. So in our design process, as I've talked about construct progressions, we've also had to define performance descriptors, those being the types of actions that you might see in a classroom that would help you determine where a child is on a construct progression. So if we look at construct progressions in general and the understanding, which is related to the claim, the skills are really what is defining where a child may be around a particular domain. The performance descriptor really gets at an action or a demonstration that the child may show you that would help you determine where they are on the performance descriptor. So again, the understanding identifies the major concepts within a particular construct. Skills identify competencies within each understanding, ranging from simple to higher levels. And performance descriptors paint a picture of performance, specifying exactly how students demonstrate their understanding or skill at each stage of the progression. Assessment means are the ways in which teachers elicit information to help them determine where children are. What can I do as a classroom teacher in the context of instruction that will allow me to see performance that then will allow me to rate where a child is on a particular progression. Assessment means in North Carolina there are multiple ways to elicit evidences of learning: ongoing observation, teacher assessments through situations and tasks, family contributions, self-assessment, peer assessments. In North Carolina, our KEA and our overall K-3 formative assessment work is really focusing on teacher assessments through situations and tasks and family contributions. We really feel that family contributions is a key part of understanding who a child is, and in our assessment we are providing opportunities for families and actually other professionals in a child's life to be able to offer information that will help us more deeply understand who a child is. So in our formative assessment process, we have constructs across each of the 5 developmental domains. The domains, of course, are approaches to learning, cognitive development, social emotional development, health and physical development, language development, and communication, and you can see the associated constructs with each of those domains. What you see in green are what is measured in the kindergarten entry assessment process, which happens over the first 60 days of school, and it happens once again in the context of instruction. We feel like the 60 days allows for a child to acclimate to a new environment, and we get a more true picture of who a child is than just doing an assessment during the first day of school or the first week of school. Finally, as I think about what we started this conversation discussing, can we improve transitions? Can we improve outcomes for kids? Can we improve the school experience for children? I think we can, as long as we think about what's important and necessary to achieve that. So if we think about the resources that are necessary, none of this is easily done without sufficient funding. Most importantly, because that funding is required to provide for effective professional development. And I think Jacqueline talked about earlier having a well-trained teacher workforce if they are in fact conducting the assessment. In North Carolina, that is in fact what will be happening. So spending a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of support, building capacity within school districts to support their teachers in the implementation of the assessment is one of our key goals. We're currently using implementation science practices to define that professional development system, but without that, we really believe we're not going to be successful. That's the root of the issue, getting at the support for teachers and their efficacy in understanding this assessment, implementing this assessment, and more importantly, using that information to improve instructional practices. So if all of these 3 gears are working well, we believe that we will, in fact, ease transitions into kindergarten across the K-3 space and improve outcomes for children. So with that, I will stop and entertain any questions that you may have.
Hi, John, this is Fiona. There are a couple of questions that have come in while you've been speaking. One of those questions is, do children receive a score based on all the assessments in all 5 domains?
So the answer to that is we are working through that process. With the kindergarten entry assessment, it is really the first part of this overall K-3 process that we will be employing in North Carolina. Again, it happens over 60 days across all 5 developmental domains. And we are required by statute in North Carolina to enter certain aspects of that data collected over those 60 days into the state longitudinal data system. So we are currently in a conversation about how to take this qualitative data, which is also defined in our general statutes, how we take that data and we turn it into scores that make sense. I would say that we are wrestling with a dilemma of, what that score should look like. What, is it a rating? Does it have a connotation that a child is ready or isn't ready for school? That's always a complicated question to answer. Here in North Carolina, as much a part of the school readiness definition as is a child's capacity, or a child's readiness for school success, is the school's capacity to serve all children. And so we want to be careful that we're not communicating that children aren't ready to be at school, but in fact communicating where they are and letting that information inform the early childhood 0 to 5 system, but more importantly, how can that information be used to help a teacher in a school in a district move their students forward.
Thank you, John. There is one additional question, Fiona. We have a moment for that.
Yes, go ahead, Jenna.
Okay. So Joe asks if how North Carolina's KEA is acquiring the information for the family contributions and what that looks like in practice.
Well, it's an iterative process, and so what I did not mention is that we will be employing an electronic platform here to collect information. But as we work with families, part of that process really through, much like Washington State has done with their WAKIDS KEA process, really through teacher-parent visitation, going through a set of questions that help elicit responses from parents that give information to teachers. We're hoping as this progresses to build a portal that will allow for parents to provide evidences that they may see at home. For instance, around health and physical development, a child playing on a flag football team, a parent might take a video phone clip of their child on the field and then submit that through a portal that is some evidence of their gross motor skills, and that could be included in the particular assessment for their child. So we're really exploring technology and what the opportunities are, and note that it is an iterative process, but we want to move to a place where family involvement is valued, and it's not just something we speak to and don't follow up upon. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks, John. We do have a couple more questions, but I think we can hold those till following the next couple of speakers, right, Fiona?
That's right. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, John. I'd like to Sorry. There we go. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Anna Severin from the Nevada Department of Education. Nevada is one of 7 states, including Maryland, Ohio, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Indiana, and Michigan, that's also participating in an enhanced assessment grant focusing on an interstate collaboration for developing kindergarten entry assessments. Anna is the Early Childhood Education Programs Professional within the Nevada Department of Education and is the Director of the Nevada State Pre-Kindergarten Programs. She has had a diverse career in early childhood education, ranging from promoting volunteerism and national service within the classroom to varying administrative roles within nonprofits, school districts, and state government-related roles. In her current role, Anna has been instrumental in helping to establish a P3 agenda, initiatives, and strategies throughout Nevada. She has also served on the Nevada State Literacy Team and Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Birth through Grade 12 Leadership Team, the Nevada Early Childhood Advisory Council, and was appointed to the Governor's Commission on Service, and she has also served on the Nevada Association for the Education of Young Children State Board. So I'd like to turn it over to Anna.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? First of all, I just want to thank REL Northwest and CELO for organizing this opportunity, and it really is an honor for Nevada to be a part of this panel with such esteemed colleagues like Jacqueline and John and Tom. And Nevada definitely has a lot to learn from other states like North Carolina, and as John mentioned, First School, North Carolina has been a great resource in our work as we develop a P3 agenda within the state. As one of the biggest little states, we've made several little steps in the right direction towards implementing the KEA, but we definitely still have a long road ahead of us, and I really appreciate this opportunity to participate in this important dialogue. And I just wanted to share a little bit about our journey. Our work really kind of started back in 2009 when the governor established the Nevada Early Childhood Advisory Council, which was really kind of the main, yeah, that's perfect. Really was one of the leading structures of moving this work forward. And in 2010, the Early Childhood Advisory Council, or NECAC, began a strategic planning process with a small mini grant. And then in 2011, the Advisory Council really decided to make developing a statewide coordinated kindergarten entry assessment tool as a priority in that legislative session that was vetoed by the governor, but that really indicated to us that we had more groundwork to do. And so from there, the council convened a school readiness summit, and as John talked a little bit about the importance of defining or having a statewide school readiness definition, we didn't really have at the time. And so the council took that as an opportunity to have a school readiness summit and define what school readiness means, and really that it's the importance of looking at all 5 domains. And as John talked a little bit about, really the importance of the schools being ready for the kids and not just the kids being ready for school. And that the purpose of KEA, as both Jacqueline and John talked about, really is using that as a tool of measuring where kids are and not as something to keep them out of kindergarten. So in June of 2012, the council adopted the school readiness definition. And then from there, we took the opportunity to use a good portion of our ARA funds to do a very comprehensive needs assessment to see really where we are statewide, what districts we're currently using, what the interest in having one common statewide kindergarten entry assessment and what that might look like. And from that needs assessment, the council ended up recommending using the Teaching Strategies Gold because really from that needs assessment, there was a very strong desire to have a tool that spans that whole continuum, birth to 3rd grade, and of course the need to have an assessment that measured all 5 of the domains that that are critical, and a majority of our Head Start programs and other pre-K programs we're currently using Teaching Strategies Gold, so we were trying to align with that accordingly. So the Council recommended piloting that tool. Okay, you can move to the next slide. And from there, the legislature appropriated $1.5 million to pilot this tool, and so we really, and in that process was also the second round of Race to the Top competition, which Nevada was unsuccessful, but we really used that as an opportunity to continue to move this forward as we engaged in this pilot process. As a part of the process, we really found it to be very important to get away from the misnomer of the KEA and started referring to it as Silver State Kids, with kids standing for Kindergarten Inventory Development, Kindergarten Inventory of Development statewide, and really helping to educate folks and administrators that this really was an inventory of skills and not an entry assessment, so to speak. So that became really important. Moving from there, as we were engaging in the pilot, in October 2013, the governor signed an executive order to restructure the state early childhood leadership structure, which moved key programs, including the Head Start State Collaboration Office, into the Department of Education. And that also included the CCCF dollars and our QRIS program within the Department of Education. And then in the fall and spring of 2014, we continued the pilot, and we're currently in our second year of the pilot, which included 7 districts, 7 of our 17 districts. As you can see, the majority of them being pre-K, because many of our pre-K programs were already using that tool, and then moving into this school year with phase 2. Move to next slide. This just kind of gives a little bit more background information in our comprehensive needs assessment and what it included. We did intense focus groups and site visits to all of our 17 districts. Over 200 providers and stakeholders and more than 500 parents participated in those, and we conducted interviews with several different key informants. And as I mentioned previously, the findings from that assessment tool really indicated a strong desire to have one tool that spanned the whole birth to 3rd grade continuum, and a really overwhelming response from parents of wanting to be able to have more information about what was expected in kindergarten and what that looked like across all of those domains. Next slide. So kind of from the last 2 years, the major accomplishments that we've been able to do with limited funding, the NECAC, or the Early Childhood Advisory Council, was able to pilot this this KEA, and included having a school readiness summit, which we were able to, the state council adopted the school readiness definition and completed that needs assessment. And also within that needs assessment include analyzing existing assessment tools that were out there that met all of the criteria, and then making the recommendation to pilot TSG moving forward, and which further, as the work continued and progressed, securing a small amount of money, but a good chunk of support from the legislature to pilot the assessment in kindergarten classrooms. Next slide. So lots of challenges and opportunities we've encountered across this process, one of which is having limited staff to oversee and manage the pilot. Currently, because it was kind of started by the Early Childhood Advisory Council and the Head Start Collaboration Office, the roles of or responsibilities of the pilot kind of fell on that position, and so it has been challenging, but we are optimistic and hopeful that now of the creation of the new Office of Early Learning and Development within the Department of Ed, and how we can continue to build infrastructure within that office and within the Department of Education. Also, as we've had the opportunity to be a part of the Maryland, Ohio Enhanced Assessment Consortium, which has been, and we've had lots of change in leadership with superintendents, so figuring out what our role is with piloting TSG and also being an advisory state within this enhanced assessment grant. Also, kids really kind of developed, because it was led by the Early Child Advisory Council, it was really perceived as an early childhood initiative, and limited K-12 leadership has been on NECAC, but also in the process, the governor has newly appointed an early childhood liaison on our P20 council, which we are hopeful that we'll be able to work closely with the Early Child Advisory Council to help build that K-12 buy-in and leadership. Also, one of the big things that we are working on, and as John alluded to in his slides, just a very strong need for ongoing support and infrastructure to support the professional development on implementation of observation-based assessment has really come to the forefront as what's being done, as many of the slides that John showed of the work of First School, of the transition between pre-K and kindergarten and what's going on in kindergarten classrooms is quite different when we look at what it means to implement an observation-based assessment. And so some of our next steps of moving forward is looking how we can build the support and infrastructure to support that support and professional development with kindergarten teachers. And within that includes the need for identifying common definitions for what terms that are commonly used in early childhood and primary grades, such as what developmentally appropriate practice means, what rigor looks like, what learning centers look like, which are all often perceived very differently in those two different areas. Next slide. So kind of 4 of the big topics of lessons that we've learned of the need to really develop a strong infrastructure for our professional development system and moving forward. We've had lots of leadership transition within the last couple of years with the state superintendent and director and new director within the new Office of Early Learning and Development, and the needs to really have adequate documentation of efforts moving forward and how we can get more involvement in the K-3 leadership. Also key to our work is involving looking at technology and how to include our IT teams in the department of integrating the data within our longitudinal data system. And also very key is collaboration. And since the beginning, Nevada's leaders have noted the benefits of working together with other states as we're all working on this at the same time and learning a lot from the Race to the Top states. And so we've had the opportunity to be a part of the Kellogg KEA project, and as we're piloting TSG, be a part of the TSG professional learning community with other states that are using that tool as well. And then also it's been tremendous help of being a part of the Maryland, Ohio EAG consortium. So it's just really, as all of the states are moving forward in this area and what's working, what's not working, it's been, I think, really helpful to be a part of those collaboratives. And then just some of the next steps we'll be doing as we wrap up the phase 2 and second year of our pilot is evaluating the pilot project. And as an advisory state in the Maryland, Ohio consortium, we'll be figuring out where we are with moving forward with that, or becoming more involved with that. And also, as I talked briefly about, enhancing how we can enhance the infrastructure and professional development related to KEA and what that looks like within our newly created Office of Early Learning and Development, and how we can connect more intentionally with the K-3 parts at the state level, and moving forward with statewide implementation of one common tool. And with that, I'll open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. We have a question for you that is, let's say the teachers evaluated the students. How do they enter those? Is it an online database run by Nevada or something else?
For the teachers that are using TSG are entering that into the TSG database and which will ultimately be uploaded into the state database system. But the teachers enter that information within the Teaching Strategies database.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Anna. We now look forward to hearing Dr. Thomas Schultz's remarks. CCSSO's Early Childhood Initiatives Program works with chief state school officers, state education agencies, and other partners to foster the healthy development, learning progress, and school success of young children birth to age 5, with a special focus on eliminating disparities in learning opportunities and outcomes for young at-risk children. It supports states in integrating early childhood, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education standards, assessment, data, and professional development efforts to form a more cohesive and powerful 21st century education system. In his role at CCSSO, Dr. Schultz works with states to improve learning opportunities and outcomes for young children. Prior to joining CCSSO, Dr. Schultz worked on early childhood research, policy, and school reform issues at the Pew Charitable Trust, the Office of Head Start, the U.S. Department of Education, the National Association of State Boards of Education, Region 5 Office of Child Development, and the Chicago Public Schools. Welcome, Dr. Schultz.
Thanks, Fiona. It's great to be here with good friends who have been presenting before me, and looking at the long list of people who registered for this, lots of you in the field that are working on these issues. What I'd like to do in kind of wrapping up this webinar is to talk about what's going on in other states that I've been working with and hearing from that are involved with KEA initiatives, building on the more detailed things that were shared from North Carolina and Nevada. Characterize some things that I think are markers of progress as states are moving into these new assessment initiatives with young children, and then kind of paralleling what Anna was describing at the end of her presentation, what I see some of the challenges coming from states as they are training and developing these initiatives with kindergarten teachers. So if we go to the next slide, as probably many of you are familiar, probably at this point more than 30 states are involved with some type of statewide kindergarten entry assessment initiative, and that's happening for a number of different reasons. One stimulus for this has been state legislation and funding and mandates from state legislatures. A new report's coming out from the National Conference of State Legislatures in the next few weeks. And they found 14 states that had enacted legislation related to kindergarten entry assessments just since 2010. A second major stimulus and support for kindergarten assessment efforts has certainly been the $1 billion Early Learning Challenge initiative by the Departments of Health and Human Services and Education that Jacqueline was involved in during her tenure at Department of Ed. And that's involved almost 20 states in new efforts to develop and implement kindergarten entry assessments. And then as both John and Anna mentioned, the Department of Education has also funded 3 multi-state consortia to have the opportunity to use federal money to develop from the ground up new assessment tools to look at kids at the transition from early childhood into kindergarten. So both through state legislatures recognizing the value of getting better information on how young children are doing before we tend to get standardized assessment data at the end of 3rd grade, and from federal leadership and federal funding, we have a lot more activity across the country in states that are kind of handling similar kinds of challenges in terms of how to mount more consistent assessments of kids statewide, looking at kids in multiple domains of development and using a common tool. So if we move to the next slide, as I talk with states about what they're doing in terms of rolling out these efforts, it seems to me that there are some really positive accomplishments that we can recognize. One is that states are taking the time to not simply adopt an off-the-shelf assessment tool, but do work to make sure that the assessment items and the design of the assessment is well aligned to their state standards for young children, both their early learning guidelines for preschool-age children and their end of kindergarten standards that in most states have been changed recently with the adoption of either Common Core or state-developed college and career-ready standards. A second major benefit, or I think outcome, that I would view as a positive through these KEA initiatives is a lot more investment in training kindergarten teachers in how to conduct broad-scale assessments of children and provide consistent data on how they're doing, including in most instances efforts to document reliability or inter-rater reliability of the teachers using a common scenario so that you're sure that there's some consistency in how they're administering the assessment. A number of states are expanding their professional development effort to include elementary school principals and other early childhood program managers. And as John mentioned, in states like Washington State and others, serious efforts to kind of engage parents in both contributing information to the assessment process, but also as an audience for the assessment information. Many states, as they are kind of implementing or rolling out their kindergarten entry assessments, are engaging teachers to give them feedback on how implementation is going through surveys and focus groups, and really trying to listen carefully to the concerns that teachers have that they need to address in fine-tuning guidance and support for these efforts. I think these enhanced assessment grant projects to me are also a really historic opportunity for states to be in charge of developing new assessment tools for young children, which is my years in the field has never really happened before. I think for decades we said it's hard to assess young children and we're not satisfied with the quality of many of the tools. We now have the benefit of money to do something about that. I think one of the pieces of feedback that I've heard from lots of states is that kindergarten teachers often have a positive feedback on the new kindergarten entry assessments because they're looking at the whole child in contrast to what has been happening in many states and local districts where they might have been just looking at literacy in their existing kindergarten assessment. So, I think stepping back, what these assessment initiatives are doing is investing in improving the capacity of kindergarten teachers to look at each child that they are getting at the beginning of the year in a more systematic way, trying to sharpen their understanding of them as individuals, and I think improving their skills in terms of observation across different domains of child development, early learning. I think that's all to the good. So that's the good news. Let's talk about challenges if we move on to the next slide. I think as states are listening to teachers and looking at what has been learned from these initial implementation activities, by far the most common concern that they're hearing from teachers is a concern that the assessments take too much time, particularly in those early weeks of the school year when teachers have such a high concern for getting to know their kids well and establishing routines, getting a good classroom community. Some of this may be due to the fact that there's a steep learning curve for implementing any new assessment, and in many cases, as I note in one of the other bullets, some proportion of kindergarten teachers are less experienced or less familiar with observational tools and with assessing children in domains beyond academic and cognitive skills. But I do think that this is a concern that may be lessened over time as teachers become more experienced with these tools. But it's a serious issue on the mind of teachers. And one of the reasons why that's true is that kindergarten teachers are also administering other types of tools that have been developed for other state and local initiatives. So those include in probably half the state's assessments, designed around the grade level reading initiatives, new teacher evaluation mandates that require teachers to gather some evidence of student learning as part of that proposal or as part of that process. And in most districts, local screening and assessments that have been initiated in relation to curriculum implementation and other kinds of screening and formative assessment purposes. So regardless of kind of the good features of a kindergarten assessment, teachers are pushing back at the multiple numbers of assessments and the cumulative amount of time that it's taking. Two other concerns to hit on is that while it's natural for states to focus on administration of the assessment and professional development on how to enter the data correctly as the first priority, there's been, in most places, not yet sufficient support for teachers in how to understand and use the assessment data. So many teachers are reporting that they're carrying this out because it's a required state mandate, but they haven't yet seen how the data is going to be useful for them in terms of instruction. And finally, I think the potential of kindergarten entry assessments to begin an ongoing process of formative assessment to guide curriculum and individualized instruction is, I think, one of the most powerful potential benefits of this type of effort. But I think it takes a lot of support for teachers to understand what they can do with information that, as John mentioned, will often create a picture of kids being at various points on a continuum of learning in different domains of development. So how teachers can orchestrate a classroom so that they can meet the varying needs of students is a big issue that we need to think through and help teachers work with. Finally, I think at a kind of a conceptual level, the last slide that I'd like to speak to is the fact that I think as we've developed these kindergarten assessments, we've seen them as things that could contribute to multiple purposes for different audiences, including aggregate reporting to state policymakers about how young children are doing in general and how trends are changing over time. As has been mentioned, use for teachers to inform decisions about curriculum and teaching, reporting back to the early childhood programs on a common tool, common metric in terms of how their children are doing, not for accountability purposes, but for information purposes, and reporting to parents. In order to do each one of those things well, we have to think carefully, as Jacqueline advised, on the way in which the assessment reporting is designed, how we work with each of those audiences. And so it's a complex matter to be able to satisfy those multiple purposes. I think as well, kindergarten entry assessments really need to be viewed as part of an overall system of assessments, as Jacqueline mentioned, including screening kinds of tools, program evaluation measures, measures that allow us to track children's progress over time during their early childhood program experience and in kindergarten through third grade. But based on the policy kind of calendar and policy mandates, they're being rolled out as a separate initiative in terms of training. So it's hard for teachers to understand how the kindergarten entry assessments will work in concert with ongoing assessments that may be happening with children as they continue in the early school years, or to connect with the assessments that have gone on in their early childhood program. And I guess for me, I end up with a sense of kind of a paradox that on the one hand, as Jacqueline has advised, there are real technical concerns if you try to use a single assessment for too many different purposes. On the other hand, if we conclude that we need to have separate assessments for the multiple purposes that we hold as important in this arena, do we end up overloading teachers with too many separate assessments? And I think charting a course that allows us to kind of address this dilemma is, to me, one of the issues to work on looking forward, as is, to me, paying more attention to the issue of helping teachers understand how to use the information that they're gathering in these kindergarten assessment initiatives so that they can tailor teaching and learning for young children that they're working with. So I'll wrap up there and be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. We have a few questions that have come in, and I'm going to start off with one for the panelists. And the question is, with the seemingly growing resistance to assessment in general nationwide, what are the panelists' thoughts on communication to the public about KEAs and their importance?
You know, just to start off, I think one way that has been effective is to have teachers themselves who find value in an assessment be able to talk with their peers and communicate to parents on the benefits of this. Often, I think there may be, more examples of that as teachers have opportunity over several years to gain experience with the tool and see the data over time. So that would be one thought.
Thanks, Tom. Do other panelists have any thoughts about that question with regarding to messaging about KEAs given perceived resistance to assessment in general?
Yeah, this is Jacqueline. I think, as I said before, it's thinking about the purpose. And so as one begins to think about a KEA, to Tom's point, we think about the multiple audiences and think about the ways in which we're going to communicate to parents. I think that's really critical. So I think for parents, this has to be something useful, as it has to be for teachers. So to make sure that teachers are really getting something out of this, they can see a better understanding of children in particular, children in general, and that they can convey to parents that through the use of a KEA, the teachers, are getting a much better understanding of how children are doing, and therefore designing better programs. I think it helps to be able to think this has some value, this is useful, and it is not just a burden. But that takes some thought and some careful planning about the audiences and to make sure that it really is useful. But I think parents want to be able to get good information without this tremendous burden that they're seeing.
I wonder if the state folks, John and Anna, could highlight for us any plans you have for communication, audiences that you have been considering, materials that you recommend, et cetera.
This is John. I would just say from the very beginning, when we really started to vision this work, we engaged stakeholders across the spectrum. So we went across the state and had family focus groups, teacher focus groups, administrator focus groups, Institute of Higher Ed focus groups, and we really listened to the perspectives that were being brought to the table, and to the degree that we could, and we listened to the advice we were given as we created the development of this. currently, we've had a series of press opportunities through public radio, through some of the bigger local newspapers in Raleigh and in Charlotte that have really written very positive pieces specific to the work we're doing, because for no other reason, the assessment is looking at the whole child and trying to hone in on the individuality of children in a classroom, and parents find that refreshing. And so, I would just caution or suggest as people begin this work, they really do think about who the stakeholders are, and they engage those folks from the beginning. And I think that goes a long way in helping relieve a lot of the concern that gets raised.
I mean, I just jump in with one more point on this, which is that I think we shouldn't dismiss the concern about over-testing, and I think it's important for local districts to be able to identify all of the tools that they're asking teachers to administer to make sure that there's a real need and purpose for each of those tools. I was at a really nice meeting last week in Massachusetts. They convened on use of assessment data, and one of the breakout sessions, districts were talking about all the different assessments that they were using in the Boston metro area. And the majority of districts, were using 5 or 6 different assessment tools, and they weren't describing it as if we're going to fix this problem tomorrow. It was more, these things have all been created for different, for different reasons. And so I think educators need to take some leadership in making sure that we are not over-testing young kids and that there's a purpose for every tool that is actually being required for teachers to use.
I would punctuate that point. I think that's one of the things we know is an issue as we go out with this work. It's funny that you in your challenges, what you raised, Tom, were probably every challenge that each of us is experiencing as we do this work. But as part of our implementation process, we have a team that is really leading that kind of conversation at the district level to really do, for lack of a better term, an assessment audit. What are the types of assessment that are occurring? What are the purposes? How's the data being used? Is it being used? What can be taken off the plate? And more importantly, how do these things fit together? And all of that is in an attempt to really help districts craft a coherent and aligned assessment process.
Thank you all very much for answers to that question. We have 3 more minutes, and all of the questions that have been submitted are pretty meaty and probably cannot be answered in 3 minutes. So what I would like to offer is that we will post unanswered questions on our website along with our archive of the webinar. We will be posting a recording of this webinar and any resources that we have at the web address listed on your screen. And as I mentioned earlier, we would very much appreciate you responding to the survey that you will be receiving from Concord Evaluation Group after the conclusion of this webinar. I want to provide panelists any opportunity for concluding remarks that you might have before we conclude the webinar.
This is Jacqueline. I just want to again highlight this notion of what John has called an assessment audit. Years ago, when I was at ETS, we worked with several districts that really had enormous amounts of assessments and didn't know why they were using them. And it's a process that can be extraordinarily helpful to go through, just lay out what are we asking teachers to do, why are we doing this, do we have multiple assessments that answer the same questions, do we have holes in our assessment landscape where we have questions that aren't answered. It's a very productive task, and I would just really suggest that for those places where you really feel that there's a tremendous burden, to take time to engage in that exercise to see exactly what you're asking teachers to do and where there might be places where you can streamline.
Yeah, I would just put in a plug for, there's a really nice tool that has been developed by Achieve, if you go on their website, that has just a really nice format of questions, a suggested process for, putting together a school district team to do this. And a lot of it is, common sense, but it's work that has been done by thoughtful people, and it's been designed for, K-12 overall, but applies as well to early childhood. So that might be a time saver if you're interested in taking on this idea.
Thank you, Tom. And with that, I would like to thank everybody from REL Northwest and CELO and our other co-sponsors for attending our webinar today. We appreciate you attending and learning more from our panelists. And please, again, look for the archive of this webinar on the REL Northwest website that you see that was on the prior slide is educationnorthwest.org. And we will make sure to communicate the information to participants following the webinar as well. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. So thank you for attending.